I went to the lake cabin to disappear for the weekend, not knowing that by the end of the day, someone would walk out realizing their entire career was about to collapse. The place was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels safe until it suddenly doesn't. I had barely put my bag down when I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, confident footsteps. No hesitation. No pause. And then came the sound that made my stomach drop. A key slides into my lock. Whoever was opening that door didn't just cross a boundary. They crossed into something they would never walk back from. The cabin itself was simple. Old wood, faded paint, a narrow porch overlooking the lake. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. My family owned it long before the surrounding neighborhood existed, long before neatly trimmed lawns and HOA signs started popping up like warnings. This place had history, and history doesn't erase itself just because someone prints new rules. The door opened without a knock. A woman walked in like she owned the place. Mid-40s, perfect hair, confident posture, clipboard clutched tight like it made her untouchable. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked irritated like I had interrupted her authority. She immediately announced an HOA inspection and started listing violations before I could respond. Unauthorized use, non-compliance, community enforcement. The words came fast, practiced, and loud enough to control the room. I told her calmly that she needed to leave, that this was private property, that it was not under HOA jurisdiction. She smiled, not friendly, smug. She said she had a master key. She said the board approved her entry. She said refusal would result in fines, liens, and further action. What she didn't know was that I wasn't alone. At the kitchen table behind me sat an old friend quietly drinking coffee. No suit, no badge, no visible authority, just flannel, worn boots, and the relaxed posture of someone who didn't feel threatened by anything in that room. To her, he was invisible. To the state, he was one of the most powerful legal figures there was. The HOA pressure hadn't started that day. It had been building for months. First came warning letters taped to my door, then emails demanding fees for things I hadn't done, then threats, liens, enforcement. I ignored them because the facts were clear. Surveys, deeds, and official records proved the cabin sat outside their jurisdiction. They kept pushing anyway, acting like confidence could replace legality. The woman moved deeper into the cabin, scanning walls, writing notes, already planning penalties. I asked her where she got the key. She brushed it off and said the board authorized everything. Her certainty was absolute, the kind that only exists when no one has ever stopped you before. That's when my friend finally stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply asked if she normally entered private property without consent. She turned toward him, annoyed, and launched into another explanation about HOA authority. She spoke louder this time, more aggressive, convinced she was still in control. He waited. Then he asked one more question, slower and clearer. "Do you know who you're talking to right now?" She laughed. She said she didn't care. Those rules applied to everyone, that she could call law enforcement if we interfered. She even reached for her phone, confident it would end in her favor. That's when he introduced himself. The title hit the room like a collision. State Attorney General. The color drained from her face instantly. Her phone froze midair. The clipboard slipped in her hand. For the first time since she walked in, her authority cracked, not with anger, with fear. The lake outside stayed calm. Inside, everything changed. She started backtracking, claiming misunderstandings, claiming emergency authority, claiming she didn't know. None of it mattered anymore. Because the moment she used that key, she didn't just enter a cabin. She opened a door that would expose everything she thought she could get away with. And what happened next would be far worse than fines. The moment his title landed in the room, time felt distorted. Not frozen, just stretched thin enough for every reaction to become painfully visible. Her confidence didn't disappear all at once. It fractured. First in her eyes, then in her posture, then finally in the way her hand started to tremble as she lowered her phone back to her side. She tried to laugh it off, weakly, as if this were all some misunderstanding she could talk her way out of. But the silence from my friend told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was an unraveling. She straightened her blazer and said she hadn't been informed of his presence, as if that mattered. She said she was acting under HOA authority, as if that excused breaking into a locked home. She said the board approved everything, as if approval could magically erase criminal trespass. Each sentence came faster than the last, piling excuses on top of each other before any of them could collapse completely. He asked her to sit down. Not firmly, not angrily, calmly, like a request that wasn't really a request. She hesitated, then sat at the edge of the chair, still clutching her clipboard as it could save her. He asked her for the master key. She didn't respond at first. He waited. The pause stretched. Finally, she placed it on the table. The sound it made was small, but it echoed in the room louder than her earlier threats. He asked where she got it. She said the HOA kept copies for enforcement purposes. He asked who authorized the copying. She named the board president. He asked how many keys existed. She didn't know. He asked how many times they'd been used. She guessed. Every answer dug the hole deeper. He explained something in a tone so neutral it was almost unsettling. HOA authority, he said, does not override state trespass laws. Private property remains private, regardless of community rules. Unauthorized entry with a copied key is not enforced. It's a crime. And intent doesn't vanish just because someone believes they're entitled to act. Her face had gone pale. She kept nodding as if agreement might soften the consequences. She tried to say it was standard practice. He corrected her. She tried to say it was for safety. He corrected her again. She tried to say no one had complained before. He looked at me, then back at her, and said complaints had been filed. More than one. That was the moment she realized this wasn't isolated. This wasn't new. This wasn't going away. He asked her to list every property she had entered using that key. She hesitated. He waited. She named 3, then 4, then stopped. He asked if that was all. She didn't answer. The silence said enough. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the lake for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. When he turned back, his voice was still calm, but something had shifted. He told her she was being instructed to leave immediately, that she was not to contact the HOA board about this meeting, that any further communication would go through his office. She asked if she was under arrest. He said not yet. Those 2 words broke her more than anything else. Not yet meant something was coming, something larger, something inevitable. She gathered her things slowly, no longer rushing, no longer loud. At the door, she turned back and tried one last time to speak. He stopped her with a look and told her to remember one thing. Authority only exists when it stays within the law. The moment it steps outside, it becomes a liability. She left without another word. The door closed, the lock clicked, the cabin fell silent again. I asked him how bad this really was. He looked at the key on the table, then at me, and said quietly that this was only the beginning. The quiet didn't last long. Silence after something like that never does. It just sits there, pretending to be at peace while something bigger gathers momentum underneath. My friend didn't pick up his coffee again. He stared at the master key on the table like it represented more than a piece of metal. To him, it was evidence. And evidence has a way of growing teeth once it leaves the room. He made a call. Not a dramatic one, no raised voice. Just a few sentences spoken carefully, the way you speak when every word will eventually be replayed in a courtroom. He gave an address. He gave a name. Then he ended the call and told me that before the day was over, the HOA would realize how badly they had miscalculated. Less than an hour later, another set of footsteps hit the porch. These weren't confident. They were rushed. The knock came fast and sharp, like someone trying to interrupt a mistake before it finished happening. When the door opened, the HOA board president stepped inside, already talking, already angry, already convinced this was something he could control. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw my friend. The recognition was instant. You could see it in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened, the way his posture shifted from aggressive to defensive in a heartbeat. He tried to recover, tried to smile, tried to pretend this was just a misunderstanding between reasonable people. He launched into apologies before anyone could ask a question, said the entry was unauthorized, said the inspector had acted alone, said the board would handle it internally. Each excuse came faster than the last, piling blame onto the one person who wasn't in the room anymore. My friend didn't interrupt him. He let the words spill out, knowing they only made things worse. When the president finally ran out of breath, my friend asked one question. Why did the HOA possess clipboard master keys to private homes outside their jurisdiction? The president hesitated. He said it was for emergencies, fire access, welfare checks, standard procedure. Every answer sounded rehearsed, and none of them sounded legal. My friend explained, calmly and clearly, that copying keys without consent violated state law, that entering homes without exigent circumstances elevated the violation from civil to criminal, that delegating authority does not include inventing power where none exists. The president tried to pivot. He suggested a private resolution. He hinted at political connections. He implied that public scrutiny wouldn't benefit anyone involved. He was offering silence in exchange for compliance. That was the wrong move. My friend stood up and told him that the matter was no longer in the HOA's control. He informed him that an investigation had already been initiated, that the inspector's actions were documented, that the master key would be logged as evidence, and that the board's attempt to conceal or redirect responsibility would only expand the scope of what followed. The president's face drained of color. He asked what would happen next. My friend told him that enforcement powers outside the HOA's legal boundary were suspended effective immediately. Any fines issued would be reviewed, any liens would be frozen, and any future contact with homeowners beyond jurisdiction would be considered interference. The president argued, briefly, weakly, it didn't last. He was instructed to notify the board to cease all enforcement activity until further notice. He was also advised to consult legal counsel, not as a suggestion, as a warning. The meeting ended without handshakes. When the door closed behind him, the cabin finally felt like it belonged to me again. But the calm was different now, heavier. Like the quiet before a storm, you know it's already moving. I asked how far this could go. My friend looked at me and said it depended on how many doors had been opened with that key. By the next morning, the situation had already grown beyond the cabin. What happened inside those walls didn't stay there. It traveled through phone calls, emails, and quiet conversations happening behind closed doors. My friend was up early, speaking in a low voice on the porch while the lake reflected the sunrise like nothing in the world was wrong. The contrast was unsettling. Nature was calm. Everything else was unraveling. He told me the investigation was moving faster than expected. Once the key and the admission were logged, it opened a door the HOA couldn't close. What had started as one illegal entry was now a pattern. Other homeowners had come forward, some reluctantly, some angrily. Stories matched. Unannounced inspections, threats backed by fines, locks opened without consent. The same excuses are repeated every time. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that afternoon. They didn't invite me, but that didn't stop the news from reaching the cabin. Panic has a way of leaking. Members argued. Fingers pointed. Everyone tried to distance themselves from decisions they'd all approved when they thought no one was watching. The inspector was placed on leave. The board president resigned before he could be formally removed. It didn't slow anything down. Official notices went out by evening. Enforcement powers outside jurisdiction were suspended in writing. All fines issued over the past year were placed under review. Homeowners were instructed to document any unauthorized entries. A temporary injunction blocked further HOA access to private property. The tone had shifted completely. What used to be threatening letters were now carefully worded apologies. What used to be authority was now liability management. That night, my friend explained the next step. The case wasn't just about trespass anymore. It was about the abuse of delegated authority, about using fear to control people who didn't know their rights, about turning administrative power into something coercive. Those cases, he said, don't disappear quietly. They tend to become examples. By the following week, state investigators were involved. Ethics committees requested records. Financial audits were ordered. The copied keys became a central issue. Who authorized them? How many existed? How often were they used? Each answer led to 3 more questions. The inspector hired her own attorney. So did several board members. Some tried to claim ignorance. Others claimed good intentions. Neither defense held much weight. When authority is misused, intent doesn't matter as much as impact. I returned to the cabin alone after my friend left. The place felt different, safer somehow, not because of locks or signs, but because the illusion of unchecked power had been broken. The lake was still the same. The dock still creaked, but the threat that once lingered in the background was gone. Then a letter arrived. Not from the HOA, from the state. It confirmed what my friend had warned. Formal proceedings were underway. Charges were being considered. Testimony would be required. What happened that weekend had set something irreversible in motion. I folded the letter and looked out at the water, realizing that the quiet I'd come looking for had finally returned. But it came at a cost no one in that HOA ever expected. Weeks passed, and the aftermath of that weekend was nothing short of chaotic for the HOA. Board members resigned one by one, some quietly, others under pressure from legal advisors. The inspector who had forced her way into my cabin faced not just suspension but a formal inquiry into criminal trespass and abuse of authority. Fines were refunded. Liens were lifted. Policies were rewritten. What had been a small, self-important organization, controlling neighborhood minutiae, became a cautionary tale, and everyone involved knew it. News spread faster than I expected, not through social media posts or viral videos, but quietly, legally, and inevitably. Homeowners shared their experiences. Lawyers discussed the case as a precedent. Even local news outlets caught wind of the story once public filings became accessible. For the first time, everyone could see the ripple effect of one overconfident HOA member stepping too far. The inspector's arrogance had been her undoing. She had thought the rules were hers to interpret, the keys hers to use, the homeowners hers to control. In reality, she had underestimated what happens when you misjudge both the law and the people behind it. My friend, the Attorney General, had only needed to observe, ask a few critical questions, and let her missteps speak for themselves. The result was swift, decisive, and final. I returned to my cabin one evening, alone, the water shimmering as if nothing had changed. But I felt the difference. It wasn't the wind, the lake, or the trees. It was the knowledge that the peace I had always sought was no longer fragile. I could walk the property freely, secure in the fact that the law protected me, not just my locks or my survey markers, but real authority that could not be bypassed by a clipboard or threats. I thought back to the first moment she walked in. The confidence, the entitlement, the way she believed power existed because she claimed it. It was almost laughable now. Almost. But the memory was a lesson too. A reminder that authority unchecked becomes dangerous, and courage, calmness, and knowledge can dismantle it faster than anger ever could. By the end of that month, the HOA was essentially dismantled. The new board, composed mostly of homeowners who had no interest in power games, implemented strict rules for inspections, master keys, and authority limits. The letters stopped. The fines stopped. The fear that had been cultivated over months evaporated, leaving only the calm that had first drawn me to the lake. The cabin returned to its rightful state, private, peaceful, untouchable. Every time I stepped onto the porch, I remembered how close control had come to slipping into the wrong hands, and how swiftly it had been reclaimed. The woman who had entered uninvited, who had believed she could intimidate her way through law and property lines, became a cautionary story shared quietly among local homeowners and legal circles alike. And as the sun set over the lake, painting everything in gold, I realized that power can be challenged, authority can be questioned, and peace can be defended. All it takes is the right person at the right moment, and sometimes the quietest cabins hold the loudest lessons. The lake stayed calm, the cabin stayed mine, and the story, though finished for now, would be remembered far longer than any fines, any threats, or any overreaching rules ever could.